John Adams, The Trials of the Second President, and the Birth Pangs of American Partisanship. The Inherited Burden. Stepping into Washington's shadow political climate. When John Adams ascended to the presidency, he inherited a nation still finding its footing, but one already deeply fractured. His victory in the 1796 election was a landmark, the first truly contested presidential race, marking the official end of consensus. Politics and the irreversible rise of the first-party system. Adams, the standard-bearer for the Federalists, championed a vision of a strong central government, focused on commerce, finance, and industrial growth. His rival, Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic Republicans, held an opposing view. A society rooted in agrarian liberty, states' rights, and limited federal power. The bizarre outcome of the election, President Adams and Vice President Jefferson, political adversaries forced into an awkward alliance, immediately signaled the inherent dysfunction of the incoming administration. Adams's authority was undermined not just by his political opponent, but by his own inherited cabinet. Loyalists to the immensely influential former Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. These men often looked to Hamilton, not Adams, for direction. Adams faced a crippling cabinet rebellion throughout his term, finding himself increasingly isolated and unable to implement his own agenda. Without interference from a faction within his own party, the Adams presidency was thus a constant battle on two fronts against the philosophical opposition, led by Jefferson, and against the powerful shadow government controlled by Hamilton. This internal war defined the political landscape, proving that the greatest threats to the Republic could come from within its own ruling class. 2. The Tempest on the Atlantic. The XYZ affair and the quasi-war foreign policy and security. The most pressing and perilous challenge of Adams's term came not from within, but from revolutionary France. The French government, enraged by the American signing of the Treaty with Great Britain, began aggressively seizing American merchant ships and their valuable cargoes. The damage to American commerce was immense, and war fever swept the coastal cities. Adams, committed to avoiding a costly full-scale war, dispatched 3 envoys to Paris to negotiate a resolution. However, the mission resulted in an international scandal, known as the XYZ affair. Instead of meeting with Foreign Minister Talleyrand, the American diplomats were confronted by 3 mysterious French agents, later designated X, Y, and Z. Who demanded an exorbitant bribe and a large loan to the French government, merely as preconditions for beginning talks. When the details of the outrageous demands reached Washington, the public outcry was deafening. The famous slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," captured the nation's indignation. Though Congress never formally declared war, Adams immediately authorized the Navy to retaliate. This began the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict, fought primarily in the Caribbean. Adams oversaw the creation of the Department of the Navy and the reconstruction of the Marine Corps, preparing the nascent nation for a modern conflict. Adams's resolute stance against French aggression was widely popular, unifying the country behind him momentarily. However, the military buildup and the necessary new taxes to fund it were deeply unpopular, demonstrating the economic and political cost of maintaining neutrality. In a world dominated by European superpowers, Adams successfully defended the nation's sovereignty, but the defense mechanism he built would soon be turned inward. 3. The dark stains of fear. The Alien and Sedition Acts, social and legal trends. The war hysteria generated by the Quasi-War provided the Federalists with the perfect pretext to crush their domestic opposition, arguing that Democratic Republicans were sympathetic to the French and thus posed a security threat. The Federalist-dominated Congress passed the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, the darkest moment of the Adams presidency. These laws represented the most severe violation of fundamental civil liberties. In early American history, the Alien Acts granted the president sweeping powers to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous. This power was squarely aimed at French and Irish immigrants, who tended to vote for Jefferson's party. The Sedition Act made it a crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, the president, or Congress. In practice, this law was designed to silence the Democratic Republican press and criminalize all meaningful opposition to the Adams administration. Social climate, the Sedition Act, triggered a nationwide wave of fear and repression. Democratic Republican newspaper editors were arrested, charged and imprisoned for printing mere criticisms or satirical attacks on Adams. The core principle of the Republic, the freedom of the press and the right to criticize the government, was violently assaulted. This episode showed that the Founding Fathers, only a generation removed from fighting tyranny, were themselves capable of using the tools of government to stifle dissent and crush political rivals. For the Democratic Republicans, Adams had become the very monarch. They had fought a revolution to escape. Ivy, the seeds of nullification, state sovereignty and economic strain, economic and constitutional trends. The Sedition Act's blatant violation of the First Amendment sparked a fierce constitutional backlash that centered on the role of the states. Vice President Jefferson and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, secretly drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. These resolutions put forth a radical and dangerous constitutional theory that when the federal government exceeds its delegated powers, as it did with the Sedition Act, individual states have the right to declare the federal law null and void within their borders, the doctrine of nullification. Though the resolutions did not gain widespread support from other states at the time, they planted the potent and volatile seeds of the states' rights doctrine, a debate that would intensify over the next 6 decades and ultimately lead to the Civil War. The Adams administration's overreach, ironically, led to the first serious challenge to the supremacy of federal law. Economic impact. The ongoing quasi-war necessitated significant military spending, leading to the imposition of new, direct federal taxes on property, houses, and land. This was an unprecedented and deeply resented measure, especially by the agrarian population who formed the base of the Democratic Republicans. While the war provided a temporary boost to shipbuilding and related industries, the overall economic mood was overshadowed by the fear of war and the direct burden of taxation. This economic resentment, coupled with the outrage over the Sedition Act, created a perfect storm of political opposition that sealed Adams' fate. The public felt their money was being taken to fund a war they didn't officially declare, while their freedom to complain about it was being stripped away. The Revolution of 1800, the peaceful transfer, and the Midnight Judge's political legacy. The accumulation of political blunders, particularly the Sedition Act, and the new taxes led to the Federalists' catastrophic defeat in the 1800 election. The nation overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic Republicans, marking a fundamental shift in political power. The election, however, produced a constitutional crisis when Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, tied in the Electoral College. The responsibility for choosing the next president fell to the House of Representatives, still controlled by the defeated Federalists. After 35 deadlocked ballots, and through backroom maneuvering by Hamilton, who despised Burr even more than Jefferson, Jefferson was finally elected president. This event is known as the Revolution of 1800, not for a violent overthrow, but for the peaceful, orderly transfer of power from one political party, the Federalists, to their bitter ideological rivals, the Democratic Republicans. Adams and his party had fiercely fought to retain power, but ultimately respected the constitutional process, confirming the endurance and stability of the American experiment in self-governance. In a final act of Federalist defiance, Adams spent his last hours in office, furiously signing commissions for dozens of loyal Federalists to be appointed as new judges and justices of the peace. These midnight judges were a desperate attempt to embed Federalist influence permanently in the federal judiciary before the opposition took over. Adams left Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day, refusing to attend Jefferson's inauguration. This desperate maneuver, however, led directly to the 1803 Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. While Adams's Federalist Party faded into obscurity, his final act inadvertently provided the context for Chief Justice John Marshall to establish the doctrine of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to declare a law unconstitutional. Thus, while Adams's single term was defined by political failure and personal isolation, he laid the constitutional groundwork that secured the long-term balance of power in the Republic. His turbulent 4 years were the essential, painful crucible that forged the mechanisms of modern American democracy.